Okay, hello everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for the Frontline Club's second book night. This is Pranvera Smith's brilliant and very special idea, because with this book club, you can meet the author. And it's a club that's not dependent on talking about just newly published books, but also ones we have been wanting to read for some time, or which we have already read and love so much that we want to share with you. Our launch event last month featured the fascinating and charming Louis de Bernier. And this month I am delighted that we shall be speaking with Elif Shafak about one of her latest books, How to Stay Sane in an Age of Division. Elif joins us, as you can see from your screens, and from everyone. Elif, thank you hugely for joining us. We have a good crowd here via Zoom, as you can see, and though I'm looking forward to future events at the Frontline Club, in the atmospheric surrounds of the Frontline Club, just near Paddington. We'll have to do a Zoom for now, but the ones in situ at the Frontline will be, eventually Zoom enabled. Elif, I feel a bit nervous, excited, as I said before, as I do before every event, but this one in particular, because I've been mentioning it to people, and when I do, their eyes light up, and including the chap up the hill in Richmond Village who runs a lovely organic grocers, and he recommended that I, as part of my preparation, watch your TED Talks. And one of my authors, whom you know, Hannah Lucinda Smith, who is the Turkey correspondent for the Times and who's written about Turkey and Erdogan and the battle for the soul of Turkey, she says hello, by the way, recommended that I should do some prep by reading The Bastard of Istanbul, which I have. And another of my authors urged me to read 10 minutes, 38 seconds in This Strange World, which I'm about a third of the way through. So this little plug for Elif Shafak, as if she needs it. But as part of the prep for this discussion, I wanted to, to read around your work as much as possible and read, listen to some interviews and watch your TED Talks. And wow, I memean, there's just so much information online, and you contribute so much to public discussion, conversation, and I'm just hoping that I can add value here today. And please let me say I am really honored to be speaking with you. So allow me to introduce you as if you need it, but Elif Shafak is an award-winning British-Turkish novelist. She writes in both Turkish and English and has published 18 books, 11 of which are novels. Her work has been translated into 54 languages. Her latest novel, 10 minutes, 38 seconds in This Strange World, was shortlisted for the Booker Prize and the Royal Society of Literature Untitled Prize, and chosen for Blackwell's Book of the Year. Blackwell's is a bookshop in London and in the UK. Her previous novel, The 40 Rules of Love, was chosen by the BBC as among the 100 novels that shape our world. Shafak holds a PhD in political science, and she has taught at various universities in Turkey, the US, and the UK, including St Anne's College, Oxford University, where she is an honorary fellow. Shafak is a fellow and a vice president of the Royal Society of Literature. She is a member of We Forum, Global Agenda Council on Creative Economy, and a founding member of the ECFR, the European Council on Foreign Relations. An advocate for women's rights, LGBTQ+ rights, and freedom of speech. Shafak is an inspiring public speaker and twice TED Global speaker. She contributes to major publications around the world and was awarded the Medal of Chevalier of the Order of Arts and Letters. Forgive me, I don't speak French. In 2017, she was chosen by Politico as one of the 12 people who will give you a much needed lift of the heart. She has judged numerous literary prizes and chaired the Wellcome Prize, and is presently judging the PEN Nabokov Prize. And you can read more about Elif on her fantastic website, elifshafak.com, and she's got links to all of her books there. So again, Elif, welcome. And so although we're here to talk about how to stay sane, we will have questions from the audience, and I'd like to explain to the audience that if you would like to ask a question, please raise your hand, and we'd like to hear from you. So to begin, I mean, I read this book on Saturday evening. Now, and I know it's 96 pages long from cover to cover, and I know enough by now not to be kind of fooled by short books like this, because it's not something that you can race through. It took me some time on Saturday evening to read and digest, and then the next day I was going back and looking through it again, and it is filled with thought-provoking profundities that reverberate for hours, and for me and for the last few days, and I'm sure that will just keep going around in my head for weeks and months and perhaps years ahead, I hope. One of your interviewers from the New York State Writers Institute, I'm sorry, I can't remember his name, called this book a pocket manifesto and a book of meditations. Fiona Sturgis, writing for The Eye, describes it as part polemic, part therapeutic tool, and a calmly rational response to extraordinary circumstances. It's divided, if you will, into sections: disillusionment and bewilderment, anxiety, anger, apathy, information, knowledge, wisdom. It is timely and resonates. So I'm going to start, though, opening this up with this very simple question. Could you tell us how the book came about? Who commissioned it and why, etc.? This is a kind of book lovers, so industry question, but how did this come about with Welcome?
May I also say how much I appreciate everything you said. Your very generous words. It really means a lot to me. I think I think it in many ways this is maybe I can call it a product of the pandemic, of what we have gone through and still going through. I had wanted to write about how to find our voice in a world that is extremely polarized and extremely politicized in some ways. Mm-hmm. But the shape of the book that I had in mind was quite different. Mm-hmm. And then the pandemic began. Mm-hmm. And I remember at the very beginning of the lockdown, with all the good intentions, I've seen some publishers sharing posts saying, well, this is not a huge difference for authors because writers are solitary creatures anyhow. So they're very used to working on their own at home. They're isolated by nature. So it's not much of a difference for a writer. Mm-hmm. And I disagree. I think that wasn't my experience at all. And I found myself struggling with anxiety, with fear, uncertainty, like everyone else, because writers do not live in another planet. We're not disconnected. But perhaps more fundamentally, I found myself questioning what I was doing, what I was writing. Because does it really matter to find the perfect synonym, to move that comma to the next sentence when there's so much happening outside the window, when there's so much inequality, injustice, and people are dying in hundreds and thousands. So I think it's a moment of existential questioning, reckoning all across the world, and writers are not immune to that. The manifesto was, in a way, my attempt to clarify my own thoughts, to understand those seemingly negative emotions that I was dealing with. But what triggered it was a walk in the park. At the time, you might remember there were some boards in different parts of London asking, when all this is over, what would you like to see changing in the world? And they were just left blank, and people would write their own answers. So somebody, anonymous, some person had written, when this is over, I would like to live in a world where my voice can be heard. And I think that was my beginning. The Welcome Foundation profile books commissioned it. And with that idea, I started writing this little booklet.
It is. That's what's going to be one of my other questions about, talking about the book as a discussion about existential crisis, both personally and as a society. I think we're experiencing that now. But to go on, I'm going to hold up something as we begin to talk about differences, maybe. I'm going to hold up 3 objects for you. Do you know what that is? You see?
Yep.
And then this is for the audience as well, a bit of, and that. And this. Do you want to tell us the story?
I think I know what you're referring to, but correct me if I'm wrong. This immediately brings to my mind my grandmother, who was a healer And in order to heal people with skin diseases, sometimes people would come complaining of warts on their hands or face, and she would draw circles. She would take these thorns, rose thorns, stab it into red apples, and draw circles around each and every one of them, uttering certain words that I don't know. And I know it sounds very irrational. I know it sounds completely unscientific, but I have observed my grandmother healing people in her own way. If I may add this very quickly, my grandmother was a very strong personality and was a very wise woman. And she was a big believer in women's empowerment, women's independence, women's education. She herself had not been properly educated simply because she was born a girl in Turkey. So she was taken out of school, and she always lamented that. And maybe she also taught me that there were different ways of attaining knowledge. So it wasn't all about diploma and graduation. I think from her, I got my love for oral culture, for folklore. Someone might say my interest in superstitions, but she's someone who left an impact on me.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much I could take from that. I mean, but I want to go back to circles, which is what you talked about in your TED talk, and how you relayed the fact that she was drawing circles around the part in the apple where and around, say, somebody had a wart, so it would dry up in the middle, right? And you talk about how if we draw circles around each other and build walls, that then within these circles, when we're just talking to each other, then ideas dry up, then our kind of life dries up, because we're just, it's just, we have nothing to feed on, no other ideas. Is that right? I mean.
Indeed, yes. So I use it in a way as a metaphor to clarify in my own mind, at least, what's going on in the world today, because I think we're constantly being pushed into tribes or artificial boxes based on sameness. And we are being told, particularly by populist demagogues, we are being told that if we're surrounded by sameness, we will be safer. And I am saying that's a lie. We are far more interconnected across the world to believe that by erecting walls and retreating into spaces of homogeneity, to believe that we're going to be safer. That is an illusion. And I think I also want to share that I come from a country that has lost its diversity, that has never appreciated diversity. And I think by losing that, we have lost a lot. So I'm not necessarily talking about a political loss or an economic loss, although that too, but something in our conscience is lost when we lose our respect for diversity and inclusion. To me, that's very crucial. I think in this life, we don't learn much from sameness, we learn from differences. So if all our friends speak like us, vote like us, dress up like us, it means we're surrounded with our own echoes, the echoes of our own voices, and echoes are repetitive. I find it very important to transcend those echo chambers, which has become an important issue, of course, with today's social media and online world.
And in going back to the point about your grandmother not going to university, your grandmother's lack of education, traditional education, I suppose. And then your mother was educated, or she kind of educated herself. She put herself through university, and now you have a PhD. Perhaps your mother had a PhD as well. I'm not sure. And I mean, we've come so far as women. My mother and my grandmother didn't have a university degree. I don't even know if my grandmother finished high school. And my mother, her family, she couldn't afford to go to university, sadly. And now look, I've been to university and I've traveled the world, and we've come so far as women, and we have so many choices now. Yet we're still in an age where we are battling for equality, and we have fears of our own safety when we're walking out into the world, right?
Yeah.
I mention this because I want to touch on Sarah Everard. I know you're a feminist and a champion of women's rights, and I think that given what's happened, we have to touch on it tonight. And one of my authors, Hannah, who I mentioned, she asked a question about this. She said, find it. She'd said, I'd love to know your thoughts on all the conversations going on about women's safety at the moment and how you think toxic masculinity in the UK compares to that in Turkey. And are you going to write a book set in the UK? She thinks you're the person who should examine the Brexit Britain in literature. It needs the eye of an outsider insider. So do you want to...
Yeah, I love that description, outsider, insider. That's very close to my heart. I remember many years ago when I used to live in Istanbul, when I was based in Istanbul, an American scholar who was doing research on women writers in the Middle East, I remember her telling me that it was very understandable for me to be a feminist, because after all, I lived in Turkey and this was a very patriarchal, sexist country. And the way she said that always made me wonder. I could never understand why she herself was not a feminist, because after all, she lived in America. So what I'm trying to say is, for a long time, many people thought that some parts of the world were solid and safe and steady, namely the Western world. And in those parts of the world, you didn't have to worry that much about women's rights. You didn't have to worry that much about LGBTQ+ rights or the future of democracy, because a certain threshold had been passed and the rights had been earned. It was in those lands over there, far away in the Middle East, in Africa, in South America, over there, liquid lands, where you had to worry about such things. And I think what happened after, especially 2016, after Brexit, after Trump happened, after we've seen country after country embracing some sort of populist nationalism, maybe now we know better. Maybe now we understand that there's no such thing as solid lands versus liquid lands. In fact, we're all living through liquid times, which means wherever we might be in the world, I think we need feminism. I think we need to worry about the future of democracy, and democracy is a much more delicate ecosystem of checks and balances than we initially assumed. So we have to become engaged citizens. We have to become active citizens, and also maybe engage digital citizens as well. But what is going on right now, the horrific murder of Sarah, the way the police treated women who came to pay their respect, to hold a peaceful vigil, the way they were not given an alternative. The police could have said, okay, you can limit the number of people who participate, make sure you are observing COVID guidelines. We all understand that. But they need to understand that there is a need, there is a rage, there is an anger, there is a sorrow, and that runs very deep, because all women know when we wake up, when we hear these news, the first thing that comes to our mind is, it could have been me. That is the basic thing. So whether you're east or west, north or south, wherever we live, every woman knows what I'm talking about. We need to have these conversations. We need lots of changes happening, concrete measures, not just empty words. But I think it's very important that men also start speaking about a certain type of masculinity that is being applauded, praised, and imposed also on them. Because one thing that I've learned in countries like Turkey, if it is true that patriarchy makes women unhappy, of course it does, it's also true that it makes men unhappy, particularly young men who do not conform to that given description of masculinity, have a very hard time. So we have to challenge this toxic masculinity together. And also we have to put pressure on our politicians, because they need to take some serious measures and concrete steps rather than just empty promises. What worries me is this cycle of violence. We feel emotional, we come forward, and then things are not forgotten, but a silence comes upon us, and then another cycle of violence, another cycle of violence. We need to break this cycle.
You talk a lot about listening and being heard as well in your books, and I think this was an opportunity missed to allow these women at the vigil to be heard, for their voices to be heard in speaking for Sarah and all the other Sarahs, right? I mean, I think also it's about not taking our privileges for granted. I remember about 10 years ago, I was in a car with another woman friend and a young woman from America. We were in Hong Kong driving around, three of us women, this young woman was 18 years old at university, and we started talking about feminism, and we said, "Are you a feminist?" or something. She said, "Well, I'm not a feminist." And I said, "Well, what do you?" We looked at each other and said, "Well, what do you mean? We're driving a car. You don't have to ask your dad for a bank loan. You can go to university. You can travel on your own. I mean, is that not, being a feminist?" And she just took it all for granted. And I think it's making the younger people aware of what, has been fought, for them, and, keeping knowledge alive of what has, been sacrificed in order for us to have these privileges.
True. Yeah. And also, I think, to me, it means nothing if we have a few successful women in music industry, a few successful everything, quote unquote, in arts or in media, in medicine. That means nothing unless we learn to empower each other. Early on, when we talked about our own family experiences, the reason why I was able to get a better education than my grandmother is because my grandmother supported my mother's education. Mm-hmm. And they supported each other at a very difficult moment in our lives. When women empower each other, I think the impact of that goes beyond generations. So to have a new approach, maybe new laws, to honor Sarah, her name, to say her name, to never forget her name, all of that is very important. We have to empower each other. It cannot be an individual struggle.
Mm. I think also we can't be, divided as a society about, this, what's happened at Clapham Common and, with her murder. It has further, it has deepened the rift, but in society, isn't it? And we need to start talking about healing language and talk about the way forward, right? And instead of, yeah.
Mm-hmm. No, true. I mean, of course,
because we're talking a lot about division but I want to also talk about, repairing the divide, yet still acknowledging our differences, which is what you're all about in your books.
Mm-hmm. Which I believe is possible if we remember and go back to the basics. For me, those basics are rule of law, their freedom of expression, they are respect for diversity. There's some core values that I think we lost sight of. Because again, if I may mention Turkey's case, let us not forget that Turkey has elections, relatively speaking, regular elections. Turkey is not a democracy. Russia has elections, it is not a democracy. When we look at countries where democracy is wounded, what we realize is the ballot box or referendums on their own is not enough to sustain a democracy. I do respect the ballot box enormously. In addition to that, you need rule of law, a free media diversity, separation of powers, checks and balances, and definitely women's rights, LGBTQ+ rights, and freedom of speech. So we have to defend all these values. If they are broken, then also democracy starts to crumble very fast.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I mean, you write that, as you said earlier, that when we all fear that there are too many choices, we all start looking for things that are the same. And the demagogues usually play on these fears, and they tell us, they start to talk to us about the benefits of tribalism, how same is better. But this is how the demagogues take hold and start to persuade people that tribalism is better. But that, leads to the fall of democracy.
Well, I think this is a golden moment for demagogues, in the sense that we are living in an extremely complicated, confusing world, full of uncertainties. It already was like this, but then came the pandemic. The pandemic did not create inequalities. It exposed the existing fractures in our societies. Mm-hmm. So where we are right now, the truth is, it is sometimes scary, because the old world is no more and the new world is not born yet. I find Antonio Gramsci's essay on this very powerful when he talks about this in-between moment. We're in between two worlds when the new world is not born yet. And that is a scary, tiring moment. There is a fatigue. And at a moment like this, the demagogue enters the picture. And the demagogue says, leave it to me. I'm going to make things simple for you. I'm going to simplify. And for a moment, that sounds like a good promise. But that's a false promise. It's a fake promise. The truth is, we are living in an extremely complicated world. It is better to understand and accept this. I also believe it's better to understand that we have massive global challenges ahead, whether it's the possibility of another pandemic. As we're speaking, our climate, our planet is burning. So whether it's the climate emergency, another pandemic, cyber terrorism, or a financial crisis, everything is interconnected. It is not possible to deal with global challenges with the forces of tribalism. It is not possible to answer international challenges with the forces of nationalism.
You say that tribalism shrinks our hearts to the extent that we become immune to the suffering of other people, that we should revel in our multiplicity as individuals and in our societies. And you also say that these sort of spaces in between, these times of great change, are, fertile ground for storytelling, for the storyteller.
Yes. Yes, true, because I think we need stories. It's not a coincidence that even though we're living in a world of fast consumption, our need for stories did not decline. It is still there. And I think I make a distinction in this book between information, knowledge, and wisdom. We're living in a world in which we have way too much information, let alone misinformation. And the truth is, we cannot process this much information. So what happens is, too much information gives us the illusion that we know something about everything. When was the last time we ever said, I don't know about anything? If I don't know the answer, I can just Google it. And in the next 5 minutes, I have something to say on that subject. But that doesn't mean I know anything about the subject. So we have to differentiate information from knowledge. I think too much information is an obstacle in front of true knowledge. So instead of having way too much information, less knowledge, and even less wisdom, let's try to change, reverse this proportion, the ratio, and have less information in our daily lives, less social media, scrolling up and down, but have more knowledge. I think knowledge requires books, investigative journalism, in-depth analysis, but it basically requires us to slow down and to go into an inner garden. And then ultimately wisdom should be the goal. Wisdom brings the mind and the heart together. And I think that requires emotional intelligence and empathy. And hopefully for that, we need stories and storytelling.
I mean, doesn't knowledge also require us to get to know each other? And in that way, we can't, make the other person the villain. And I love how you humanize your characters in your books. So even the villains are sympathetic. Let me just find that question I have here about the sympathetic villain. Sorry. Yeah. So when I first went to Burma, for example, I did as much reading of history as I could around the place at the time. But it wasn't until I read Amitav Ghosh's The Glass Palace, his novel, that I truly began to understand, some of the historical nuances. And I think that that's what you do in your novels with your storytelling. You bring in the history of all the different places and personalities with all your characters' various backgrounds, and thereby giving us multiple points of view. And your characters, including, most importantly, I think your villains, are complex. We as readers understand what motivates them, what has influenced them for better or for worse, what has influenced their psyche, and thus we feel for them, and find it very hard to hate them, even if they've done frightfully terrible things. Can you expand on this, the sympathetic villain? It's very hard to achieve. I mean, I'm always, talking to not always, but, I explain to my novelists sometimes that, you have to, when the villain is sympathetic, he or she has to be as fulsome a character as the good guy or the good girl.
Mm-hmm. I think perhaps it's because I don't believe in heroes, and I think human beings are complex. we all contain multitudes, like Walt Whitman used to say, and perhaps we've forgotten to say that we have a multiplicity inside. So I'm interested in that complexity, but I'm also interested in maybe a certain cognitive flexibility that allows us to put ourselves in the shoes of another person for a few chapters, for a few hours. That is a good intellectual exercise. Maybe it's a good spiritual exercise for all of us to leave our comfort zone for a little bit and try to see the truth from someone else's perspective. I don't necessarily look at my characters as good characters versus evil characters. It's the story that I'm after, but I'm also after silences. So of course, as storytellers, we love stories, we love words, we love the rhythm of language, but I believe we're equally interested in silences. At least I know that I am. So when I write, it is those silences that I'm drawn to. What are the issues that we cannot talk about? What are the taboos, whether it's political, cultural, sexual taboos? I think a writer's job is not to try to teach something or preach something. I don't like that, actually. I think a writer's job is to ask questions. That's it, you know, but including difficult questions about difficult issues, and create an open space in which a diversity of opinions can be heard, and then always leave the answer to the reader, because every reader is going to come up with their own answers. I have met couples who have been married for 30 years. They read the same novel. They don't read it in the same way. I have met very good friends, dear friends, who, you know, read the same novel. One of them loved it, the other one hated it, or they felt connected to different characters. Why? Because each reader's reading is unique, like our fingerprints. We bring our own gaze into the story, and the writer has to respect that. But all I can add is that for me, it's important to understand that we're living in a world where so many people are constantly being dehumanized. And I think literature swims against that tide and tries to rehumanize people who have been systematically dehumanized. So rather than paying attention to the center, I'm more interested in the periphery, in the margins, in people who have been pushed to the margins, people whose stories we don't hear. And that's why I think literature can make the invisible a bit more visible and try to give a bit more voice to those who are voiceless.
So another sort of writerly question. I mean, as you say, you're showing us, not telling us. You just tell, you know, you show us, you know, how the story, the characters are, what the story is about, and you let the readers make up their own minds. And that's a real gift as a novelist. And so in one of your TED Talks, another kind of writerly question, in one of your TED Talks, you suggest that instead of being advised to write what you know, fledgling authors should allow their imaginations to wander, and should be allowed the freedom to inhabit another voice or body. I mean, have you had any sort of blowback for this statement? Is this in fact cultural appropriation? Oh, dare I mention it? And don't you in fact draw upon your own very cosmopolitan experiences, your own multiculturalism, your Oriental Occidental fulcrum, you know, your own insider outsider sensibility to inform your own writing? I mean, in essence, you are writing what you know, as you've had the privilege of living, traveling around the world when other writers might not have been able to, you know, for economic or other reasons. A bit of a devil's advocate kind of question here. Would you comment?
Yes, and I appreciate your question. I, as I mentioned slightly earlier, I'm critical of a certain form of identity politics. And rather than using singular identities, I like to emphasize multiple belongings. When I look at myself, of course, I'm an Istanbulite, and I think my love for the city is quite visible. And anyone who has read my work can see that Istanbul is not a background, passive scenery or decor. It's a she city, an active personality. And I think I carry it with me. But I also feel attached to the Balkans. So put me next to a Bosnian, Romanian, Bulgarian, Greek author. I have so much in common with them. Equally, I have elements in my soul from the Middle East. Put me next to a Lebanese, Syrian, Iranian, Iraqi author. I have so much in common with them. I am European by birth, the values that I share. Over the years, I became a Londoner, I became a British citizen. And despite what Theresa May has been telling us throughout this Brexit saga, I would like to see myself as a citizen of the world, as a citizen of humanity. That doesn't mean that you're floating in the air, you know, without any care about anything. I think just the opposite. It means you do care about so many things, several things at the same time. Now you might say, well, that's a privilege, that's a luxury. Not everyone has such international connections. Fair enough. But I think whether we are, whether we travel or not, regardless, each and every one of us as human beings contains multitudes. Maybe you were born in the same town, you know, and then you had your own family in the same town, your own education in the same town, but through your own sexual identity, through your own political affiliations, through the stories of your own ancestors, and many other things, you contain multitudes. I spent some time in Boston in women's studies researching, and it left a huge impact on me, African-American women's movement of 1960s and 70s. So when you read people like Audre Lorde, there's a huge emphasis on multiplicity in women's movement of the time. Because many of these women were women of color, they knew how racism worked. They were on the receiving end of racism. Because many of them were women, they were on the receiving end of sexism. Many of them came from disempowered communities. They were not born with a silver spoon in their mouth, you know? And so they knew how class hierarchy and privilege worked like. And many of them happened to be LGBTQ+. So they knew how homophobia worked or transphobia worked. So when they talk about power, they talk about power in a much more nuanced way than we do today. Equally, when they talk about resistance, they talk about it in a much more nuanced way. And there's a part of me that is longing for that kind of emphasis on multiplicity.
Yeah, I mean, these themes, you know, they are infused in your books, not just in how to stay sane in an age of division, but also in The Bastard of Istanbul and 10 minutes, 38 seconds in a strange world. I mean, for example, in The Bastard of Istanbul, you know, you write about it's no good to be in between. International politics does not appreciate ambiguity. And on page 171, you say Istanbul was cosmopolitan once. On page 177, I like abstractions. Literature needs freedom to thrive. On page 201, the notion of outside people be the inside people, etc., and especially the pomegranate chapter. This is all about togetherness and division, but also, you know, your characters, as you say, you know, through your characters, you are writing about the nuances of a person's, you know, multiplicity of character. And I think, you know, that's why your characters become so vivid in the reader's mind, and come alive with us. No, I don't think we have any questions yet from the audience. I'll ask. I want to ask one more question, and then we'll open it up. I've got reams of notes, but I want to talk to you about this one passage in How to Stay Sane. It's kind of pages 50 to 53. It's a personal interlude and a passage on progress. And this struck me really deeply, in part because what I was talking about, you know, with my mom and my grandmother and your grandmother and mom, and the assumption also that progress is everything, that betterment, you know, is everything, that without this expectation we go into decline as a society, right? And but shouldn't we understand what betterment is? You know, this is what I kind of struggle with personally. Like, are many of us not at the point where we have so much, especially in the West, you know, when is it enough? And de Tocqueville predicted that social frustration increases as social conditions improve, and that democracy would bring an excess of materialism, the tyranny of the majority over thought, and isolated individuals. And I think maybe for many years we have been indoctrinated that more is more, that we must do better than our parents. And I think this is like a wholly capitalist and Western construct put in place as motivational propaganda. And I'm no Marxist, let me be clear, but today, could we not agree that perhaps our parents have, with their achievements, given us a choice whether which in itself is a luxury, to live in a bedsit writing poetry or to strive to live in a mansion in Mayfair. We are in the West drowning in choices, but feel conversely deprived. That, as you say, our expectations are falling, that our hopes are frustrated. But what we hope for, is that not also a reflection of what is expected of us? That's my question. I mean, of what has been sold to us as ideal. We are now in an age in the developed world where we can talk about the pursuit of happiness without irony.
I appreciate your question. I think I make a distinction. For me, progress is not necessarily having more. It's not like having more cars, having more money, having more of everything. Progress is looking around and realizing who is not invited to the table when decisions are being taken. Who are the people who are left out and left behind? I think inequalities, plural, need to be at the core of all of our discussions from now on. And we need to care about whether it's racial inequality, gender inequality, regional inequality, or for instance, digital inequality. As we're going through this pandemic, if so many children cannot have access to education simply because they don't have broadband or a proper computer, we need to also talk about digital inequality. Mending these inequalities, reforming our societies is essential. That's my definition of progress. So again, when sometimes people with all good intentions, they ask, when are we going to go back to the way things were before? When are we going back to the normal? That world was not normal. We cannot go back. And rather than romanticizing the past, which is something that nationalism does a lot actually, we have to understand this moment in time. And this is a moment of reconstruction, renewal. We have to rebuild our societies, not on the basis of more, but on the basis of equality, inclusion, dignity. I think these are the core values that we need to remember and go back to.
Okay. Thank you. Now, look, I'm sorry because I had not pressed the Q&A button, as Pranvera said, press the Q&A button and you'll see there are 6 questions waiting. So here we are. I have a question from Jerry Clare, and we're doing this just by me reading out the questions in case anybody's at home in their pajamas. So is conformity, he asks, a form of violence? Is conformity a form of violence?
Yeah. Interesting question. I mean, the way I take this question, it reminds me of the memoirs of survivors, for instance. I read the memoirs of people who have gone through the darkest chapters through human history, including the Holocaust, including genocides, civil wars. And there's a very basic question that survivors ask us. They're saying, how is it possible that such horrific atrocities can take place? Is it because by nature, human beings are evil? And the answer that many survivors give is that not exactly. There are some evil people, but relatively speaking, their numbers are small. But these atrocities we're talking about are at a large scale. So how is that possible? And therefore the survivors are saying maybe the opposite of good is not necessarily evil. Maybe the opposite of kindness is not necessarily wickedness. Maybe the opposite of good is actually numbness, is indifference, is the moment we stop caring, listening. You know, if it doesn't matter anymore whether it's 5,000 refugees, 500,000 refugees, if I don't even register the numbers and stop caring, if enough number of people stop caring about what's happening in Myanmar, let's say in China to the Uyghurs, you know, in Turkey to journalists and to the civil society, in Poland with LGBTQ free zones, etc. If enough number of people stop caring, then really horrific things do start to happen. That's why I think numbness is very, very problematic, and we need to be maybe conscious of the danger of apathy and numbness.
And this is why it's important for stories to be told of each human individual and their response to the world, right? So, I mean, here's another question. This is Kelly Hale. You are in the unique position to exist between 2 cultures. Each time you return to Turkey, how has your relationship with your home country changed over the years? And how are you treated when you return to Turkey? How do you relate to others, institutions, cultural norms?
This is an emotionally difficult question for me, the truth is, because on the one hand, of course, I feel very attached to Turkey. And maybe the life of an immigrant is a very fractured existence because you're almost in two places at the same time. There's a part of you that you left behind, but you haven't forgotten. So I feel very attached to the people in Turkey, women, youth, minorities, the culture. You know, if I hear a song, sometimes it makes me very emotional. I haven't been able to travel back for many years now. So exile, self-exile are also concepts that I care about a lot, that I think about a lot. But if I may put it in these terms, if you're a writer in Turkey, I think your experience would be quite schizophrenic, might be, in the sense that from the authorities, from the elite, you will constantly get a slap and, you know, there will be constraints on your freedom of speech. Anything you say might offend someone. People do understand, of course, that it's very difficult in a country like Turkey to question political taboos. But sometimes people forget that it's equally challenging to write about sexuality, to write about gender. So anything you say might offend someone, and words are very heavy. Because of something you say in an interview, because of a poem, because of a line in a novel, you might be demonized, stigmatized, put on trial, or exiled. So that's the dark side of the experience of a writer. But then there's another side. That's why I said it's a bit schizophrenic, because from the people, you might get a lot of love, you know, heartwarming connection. Because in countries like Turkey, paradoxically, books matter, stories matter, you know, words matter. And many of my friends from India and Pakistan tell me it's almost the same over there as well. In Turkey, a book is not a personal item. You don't just read it and then put it back on the shelf. If you like it, you pass it on. You give it to your neighbor, and your neighbor sends it to her son who is doing his military service. And then that soldier reads it with other soldiers. Wow. So books are shared. I have seen so many copies of my books underlined by different colored pens because different people have read those same books. So that to me is incredibly precious and heartwarming. And that's the beauty of being a writer in a place like Turkey.
And I have a question here, anonymous attendee. You said that we must discuss difficult issues, nothing should be taboo, yet the ongoing culture wars and identity politics have led to cancel culture in many spaces. Writers should have the right to offend. Is anything off limits?
So I think there's a balance. I do believe in freedom of speech, but I'm also very conscious about the dangers of hate speech. So for me, it's important to underline what hate speech is and put that in a separate place, particularly the kind of hate speech that targets individuals, minorities, people who are not in positions of power and who do not have power. So that kind of hate speech that incites violence against minorities is something that we need to be very, very conscious of and alert about. But other than that, I do believe in the need for intellectual exchange. I think we all should be willing to hear arguments that we don't necessarily agree with. And actually, I find that exchange important. But hate speech is something completely different. And there's a lot of that going on at the moment. And of course, you know this better than I do. When you're a journalist, a women journalist, you even get another layer of sexism, both online and offline. We have seen this in this country as well, again, throughout Brexit, female opposition MPs getting death threats and rape threats. So there's another level of language that I think we need to be very conscious of. And that's something completely, you know, I can't approve that.
Another question, what can we define as sane in this time? Sanity for one person may be insanity for others, don't you think? This is Abdullah Nasir Awan.
That's a brilliant question, and very fair to ask. I think what I mean is, at a moment like this, it is okay not to be okay. It is okay not to feel okay. Because of all these challenges that we're dealing with, we need to allow ourselves to be anxious sometimes, to be angry, to be frustrated, or to feel tired sometimes. In fact, if we're not feeling these emotions from time to time, maybe we're not really following what's happening in the world, right? Here, there, and everywhere. When we do follow, of course, it makes us sad, it makes us angry, it troubles us, and that's human. So rather than, my definition of sanity does not necessarily put away these negative emotions or sweep them under the carpet or try to repress them. Rather than that, I want to understand where these negative emotions come from, recognize their existence, and hopefully try to turn them into something more constructive, more positive, both for ourselves individually, but also for our societies.
Joe Coburn, we have the age of strong men, Trump, Putin, Bolsonaro, Erdogan, but also the rise of female leaders, Merkel, Jacinda Ardern, Nicola Sturgeon. Does that give you hope?
It gives me hope that female leaders across the world have dealt with the pandemic in a much more efficient way. It gives me hope that so many women are raising their voices, and refusing to be silenced. I think there is a moment of change coming, but that is why we need to be a bit more alert. Because change is happening, it's also happening demographically, because the younger generations, rightly so, are asking difficult questions, and they are demanding equality, they are demanding dignity and justice. But because change is happening as we are speaking, there's also a backlash. Who would have thought years ago that in beautiful Spain, we would see buses, right, hired by the Vox movement that is longing for the good old days of Franco, right? The Vox movement hiring these buses with pictures of Hitler on it, underneath saying #feminazi, accusing feminists of destroying traditional family values. Equally, we've seen in Italy with Salvini and these family conferences with money directly coming from evangelical organizations in America. We have seen again a big attack against feminist movements, and again, feminists being accused of destroying traditional family values. Then you can look at Hungary, where gender and women's studies are being closed, shut down. You can look at Poland. Of course, you can look at Turkey and Brazil and elsewhere. So country after country, there is a backlash precisely because there's more and more people demanding progress.
I hate to keep skipping from question to question, but I think we must, rather than just, because we have so many great questions here. And I want the audience to be, involved here. So Sir Tan Sanderson said, when you recognize the humanity of the villains in our lives, be that in fiction or in the context of acknowledging how, as you said, men, for example, are also hurt when we allow toxic masculinity to flourish, is this generic statement you made about the concept of evil? Should we, for example, acknowledge that under apartheid in South Africa, white people also missed out on being part of the fullness of the rich society that was actually there, or that Israelis are mixing out on mixing with Palestinians and vice versa? Do we need our villains? Complicated question.
It is a complicated question. Rather than dividing human beings into villains or the good people, I think I want to look at power structures. If there's going to be a proper change, there has to be a change in power structures. You cannot end racism unless people who benefit from racism start losing their power and privilege and comfort zones. It's a shifting of power. You need to give more power to those who are disempowered. That's how my mind works, rather than dividing people into categories. Equally, if women are going to have more voice, things need to change in a patriarchal system. Equally, if sexual minorities are going to have dignity, equality, things need to change in a system that is inherently homophobic or transphobic. So we need to question power relations and power structures. And I think it is important that that kind of struggle is needed all across the world, because it's not something that we can take for granted. And we have seen, especially with these extreme abortion laws that are being tried to imposed and introduced in America, in Poland, and elsewhere, we see that it's very easy, if we're not aware of who's making the laws, who's holding the power relations in their hands. If we don't pay attention to these things, then we can go backwards very fast.
Helen Ventura, I was taken aback that in the tough setting of 10 minutes, 38 seconds, that the bond of friendship shines through, especially among such a diverse group of people. This was so uplifting. Is this the kind of friendship group? Is this kind of friendship group really feasible, really a feasible entity in Turkey today? I mean, you have a kind of a similar friendship group, don't you, in Bastard of Istanbul at Cafe Kundera, where you talk about the disharmony that you say, in Cafe Kundera, you say in any case, nothing was done in harmony, but in that dissonance, there lay an unusual cadence. I love that.
I love that. I love the way the word life affirming was used in the question. But to me, that is important. For instance, 10 minutes, 38 seconds in a Strange World, even though it's a book that deals with difficult subjects, including sexual abuse, I also believe, I hope it's a life-affirming book. And the reason why I hope it's that way is because it celebrates diversity, it celebrates friendship, solidarity, sisterhood, and these things matter enormously. That's what I have observed in Turkey, especially in countries where appreciation of diversity is lost. And it is difficult to be different. If there is no appreciation of diversity, if you are deemed to be different for whatever reason, it could be the color of your skin, it could be your sexual identity, it could be how you look. If you're regarded as different in the eyes of the majority or authorities, then your life is going to be difficult, right? So especially among people who are pushed to the margins, solidarity becomes all the more important. And I think that is why in this book, friendship plays such a big role. But the one thing that I need to mention is an actual graveyard that exists in Istanbul that also is mentioned in this book. In Turkish, we call it Kimsesizler Mezarlığı, which means the cemetery of the companions, people who don't have a companion in life. And I started going to this place years ago, trying to understand who are the people who are buried there. Because there are no marble tombstones, there are no names, surnames written, only wooden placards with numbers scribbled on them. And when the numbers disappear, everything disappears. And when you do research, you realize most of the people who are buried there have been shunned, rejected by their own families or their communities. There are many LGBTQ plus members there. There are some suicides, people who have committed suicide. There are abandoned babies, there are sex workers, and there's a growing number of refugees. When we read about refugees who have lost their lives as they were trying to come into Europe, we rarely question, what happens to their bodies. The bodies are taken to the cemetery of the companions in Istanbul. So it's a very sad and it's a very strange place where an Afghan refugee or a Syrian refugee might be buried next to a Kurdish transgender citizen or a Turkish sex worker or an abandoned baby. They're all there. I think my inclination was to try to reverse that process and try to tell myself and my readers that these people are not companions. They might have been shunned by their families or by their communities, but it doesn't mean they had no friends. So I think friendship is a huge part of this book, deliberately so, because it is one of those things that keeps us alive when everything else fails us.
Yeah, there's a photograph of this in the back of your book, the cemetery of the companionless in Turkey. I don't know if people can see that. Yeah, I want to, okay, it's another question. I want to go back to the discussion about division and otherness, and social media, and our existential crisis, you know, back where we started this discussion. You say on page 28 to 30 of this book, and we'll go bring the audience in after this as well. Today, social media and digital communication have both accelerated and heightened group narcissism. I love that term. Stuck in our whispering galleries, we have become bad listeners and even worse learners, interacting less with theories that do not agree with our own. And some of this book, Elif, reminded me of this, of Byung-Chul Han's The Expulsion of the Other, Society, Perception, and Communication Today. This book was given to me by a friend. Have you read it?
No, I haven't.
I'd love to hear you in conversation with him. The description of this book says the days of the other, capital O, are over in this age of excessive communication, information, and consumption. What used to be the other, be it as friend or eros or as hell, is now indistinguishable from the self in our narcissistic desire to assimilate everything and everyone until there are no boundaries left. The result is a terror of the same. Lives in which we no longer pursue knowledge, insight, and experience, but are instead reduced to the echo chambers and illusory encounters offered by social media. It is only by returning to a society of listeners and lovers, by acknowledging and desiring the other, that we can seek to overcome the isolation and suffering caused by this crushing process of total assimilation. I mean, in essence, he values difference, as you do.
Yeah, but lots of similarities, definitely. And the paradox is, early on we were mentioning, when I was talking about these signs that I saw in different parks in London, someone saying, I want to be heard when this is over. I think that paradox is very important, because we were promised, remember, early 2000s, late 1990s, there was so much optimism in this world. We thought that thanks to digital technologies, each and every person was going to have a voice. And fast forward right now, we're living in a world where there's so much noise, we feel paradoxically voiceless. We realize we are being unheard. And that's why I think it's important to slow down, to listen to each other. I have many readers in Turkey who might have quite xenophobic views, for instance, about minorities. Because this is the only narrative, this is the only discourse that they have heard in their families, at school, in their communities. I have many readers who you come from a very homophobic or transphobic setting, you know? But then the same people come and they say, I've read your book, and this is the character that I related to the most. This is the character that I love the most. And they get upset at me if anything happens to that character. So there's an emotional bond there. And then I realized maybe the character they're talking about is a minority member, right? So it's maybe Armenian or Jewish or Greek or Kurdish or Alevi, the main minorities in Turkey, or gay or bisexual or transgender. So how is it possible that people who are in their daily lives, in public spaces, more judgmental towards the other, when they are alone, when they go to the inner garden and read about someone else's story, they become just a little bit, perhaps, more ready to understand the other and to connect with the other. Maybe they become a bit more ready to realize that the other is my brother, you know, I am the other. So I don't think that's a coincidence, because totalitarianism relies on collectivistic energy. It erases all individuality. It requires synchronized energy. When you tell a story to a human being, you break that energy. Not in a selfish way, but we open up an individuality that connects with our fellow human beings. I think that is why stories can make a difference, and I hope they will.
Yeah, you talk in one of your TED Talks, you talk about you say, why is it that we underestimate the collective power of feelings and emotions exploited by illiberal politicians, but not taken seriously otherwise, and however much they matter?
Yes, because I think when we look at political analysis, rarely you come across an analysis of that takes emotions seriously, because it's not quantitative data, and especially in my field, in political scientist, in science, emotions cannot be measured, and I think they're underestimated so many times. But I think that's a mistake, because we live in an age in which emotions guide and misguide politics, but they're equally guided and misguided by politics too. So it's a two-way road. And we need to talk about what anxiety does to us, what fear does to our societies, how it shapes politics, or how it is shaped by political demagogues. We need to talk about uncertainty, what it does to our psyche. So we will see, for instance, the outcome of the pandemic, its emotional toll. And I think it's healthier to be ready for these discussions rather than pretending it has no effect or impact on our societies, because it does have an impact.
I mean, were you back and forth to America in the last 4 years while Trump was president? I mean, you were.
Yeah.
Yes. So you will have seen the kind of the flag waving, I mean, these enormous flags that the Trump followers would wave and fly from their car, and it was real, a cult of personality there. And
yes, it is a cult of personality, but rather than or more than Trump himself, it is Trumpism that worries me. It is what has been done to basic democratic institutions that worries me, whether it's rule of law or the changes in the electoral laws, disenfranchisement of people and minorities. All of that worries me. And the changes in the language of politics, even in the UK. When I first moved to this country, I used to think, it's amazing, British people are so calm when they talk about politics. I no longer think that way, I think that calmness has evaporated, mainly throughout the Brexit discussions. But what has changed is we went through a time when political language became replete with martial metaphors. Suddenly opponents became enemies. Suddenly disagreement was labeled as surrender. That kind of martial, warlike language is something that we need to be aware of. When I see tabloids with pictures of judges printed and underneath it says enemies of the people, that makes me stop. And I do get worried, because I've heard that kind of language elsewhere. And we know, those of us who come from wounded democracies, we know where that kind of language takes us. So I think it's very important to understand the importance of basic democratic norms and institutions.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder, I'm American, and although I haven't lived there for 26 years, and when I go back, I feel like I'm, relearning what it's like to be an American. You lose some of the language and some of the cultural references, if you've not been home for some time. And I mean, what I loved when I first moved to this country, to the UK, was that, everybody could sit around the dinner table and talk politics and talk about sex and talk about religion. I mean, these were the three taboo topics around, the dinner tables in our household. And, you might wonder, well, what else do you have to talk about then? But now, when I go home, you really cannot talk about politics unless you're talking about it, as you say, in the echo chamber. If I'm I can't, my best friend in the world doesn't agree with me about politics, so we agree not to talk about it. She's like a sister to me. And I wonder, how can we get back to that space in this country and in America where we can talk about our different beliefs and emerge from the dinner table still friends, and not having had an obstreperous conversation where we decide that we can't be friends anymore. How can we get to that point?
Yeah, no, I find this question so important. And to be honest, I think it's going to be one of our biggest challenges, not only this year or next year, but in the decades to come. How do we communicate across the dinner table, across those divides? Because the opposite is quite scary. And there's a reason why autocrats or demagogues love to divide societies
Mm-hmm.
because they benefit from it. They
Mm-hmm.
benefit from constant tension, antagonism. When
Mm-hmm.
people stop talking to each other, the only people who benefit from that are the autocrats themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So we have to do better. I'm not talking about, communicating with racists or extreme sexists, but many people who are conflicted, who are complex.
Mm-hmm.
We can have conversations across the board when it comes to that kind of spectrum. And I think it is important, because otherwise that tension is not going to benefit us at all.
Mm-hmm. I'm just checking the time here. I think we've got time for another question or two from the audience. Ramashama, my question for Elif is, how do people of color or marginalized people speak out about injustices and still belong, still embody a coming together?
So how do minorities speak about injustice and still
belong and still embody a coming together?
Because I think people have every right to say, what about my truth? What about my story? For instance, if I may give an example by looking at the way history is being taught, where I come from, Turkey is a country with a very long history, with a very rich history, but that doesn't mean we have a strong memory. I think we're a society of collective amnesia. Our entire relationship with the past is full of ruptures. There's a big void. And that void is usually filled with ultranationalist or Islamist interpretations of the past. Mm-hmm. So someone coming from a minority background can say, wait a second, you're teaching what happened in 16th century, 17th century, this chapter of history, that chapter of history, but you're not telling what happened to my ancestors. You're not telling the story, in a way that also honors my experience. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a very legitimate question. Mm-hmm. So that same principle can be applied not only to history, but also to this very moment. Who are the people, or what are the voices that we're not hearing? Who are the people who are not invited to the table when decisions are being taken? Mm-hmm. If we want a peaceful, healthier, happier society, I think we need to reconnect with each other and understand inequality. And I also believe we need to reconnect with nature, with environment, and realize that we're not the owners of this planet. We're not the owners of the environment. Mm-hmm. So have a more circular, embracing understanding, both in our dealings with society and also in our dealings with environment. They need to go hand in hand.
I think, thank you, Elif. I think we've just about run out of time, and I think we'll wrap it up here. But I want to thank you for this very stimulating discussion and for bearing with some of my mundane questions, I feel. But I want to thank the audience for their lovely and very informed and thoughtful questions. And thank you, Pranvera and Mario, for putting on these book nights. And I would urge everybody in the audience and to tell their friends about this night and to look onto the Frontline Club's website for all the other events that they host. And for details of when the club will reopen. And remember, they have the best melanzane parmigiana in town and the best fish and chips and fantastic cocktails as well. But look, Elif, thank you so very much for joining us. And I'm just going to close with something that you have written. You said, the art of storytelling is one of our last remaining democratic spaces. Now it must become one of our main acts of resistance against dehumanization. Yeah. Thank you. Thanks everybody for joining us.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thank you.